Chapter 1. Love at First Sight. In the warm embrace of a Parisian spring, where the air held the scent of blooming wisteria and the distant hum of the city filled the night, Luc and Camille's paths first crossed. It was the 1990s, a time when the world seemed wide open and the future glittered with promise. Luc, a young man with a passion for architecture, had recently moved to Paris to work on his first major project. His life was a whirlwind of ambition, late nights, and sketches strewn across a small apartment that overlooked a cobblestone street. Camille, a lively spirit with a love for literature, spent her days working in a quaint bookstore nestled in the heart of the city. Their meeting happened by chance at a gallery opening, where they both found themselves drawn to a painting that captured the vibrant streets of Paris at dusk. Camille, entranced by the delicate brushstrokes, moved closer to study the painting. Luc, caught in a moment of admiration for the same piece, turned and noticed her. She seemed like a part of the art itself, effortlessly elegant, with eyes that reflected the same mystery as the Parisian night. He watched her for a moment, her presence so immediate and real against the timeless art. From that moment on, the course of their lives shifted as if guided by some invisible thread. They met again days later, this time at a small cafe near the Seine, where they sat a few tables apart. Luc glanced up from his sketches to see Camille reading a book, her hair catching the afternoon light. They exchanged shy, fleeting smiles across the tables, each one lingering a little longer than the last. It was in these shared silences that their connection began to take shape, a language that didn't need words, a pull that felt as natural as the river's flow. As weeks turned into months, Luc and Camille spent more time together, exploring the city that had brought them close. They wandered through gardens where cherry blossoms fell like gentle snow, strolled along riverbanks under moonlit skies, and discovered hidden corners of Paris that felt like their own secret worlds. The city became their playground, each encounter more intimate than the last. Camille would guide Luc through her favorite bookshops, where they would lose track of time as they browsed dusty shelves. Luc, in turn, shared with her the architectural wonders of Paris, the way light played off the old facades and how each street had its own rhythm. Luc's quiet passion found a mirror in Camille's poetic nature. He admired the way she saw beauty in the smallest things: a crumbling facade, the notes of a street musician, the scent of rain in the morning. Camille, for her part, felt a warmth in Luc's quiet determination, in the way he carried himself with a subtle grace, like he was always listening to some unspoken melody in the air. Together, they crafted a world of their own, where each moment felt like a promise and each glance held a future. Their love grew like a wildflower between the cracks of a busy life, surprising and unplanned, but resilient. Luc found himself thinking of Camille even during the longest workdays, imagining her smile, her laugh echoing like music through the quiet corridors of his mind. Camille, in turn, felt a new energy in her step, as if the city itself had taken on a new light with Luc's presence beside her. It wasn't long before their connection deepened into something more tangible. In a moment that felt both inevitable and magical, they found themselves in each other's arms one late summer evening, the city lights flickering like 1,000 stars around them. There, beneath the Paris sky, they sealed their love with a gentle embrace, knowing without words that their lives would never be the same. Days turned into nights, and time seemed to stretch endlessly in those moments when they were together. The rhythm of their hearts became intertwined with the pulse of Paris itself, each step they took together feeling like a step toward the future. Luc and Camille began to dream beyond the present, imagining a life together in a small home on the edge of the city, where mornings would start with the sun spilling into their shared space, and nights would end with whispered promises beneath a blanket of stars. Paris, once a city of strangers, became their sanctuary, a place where two souls had found each other amid the noise and rush. And so, the first chapter of their love story unfolded, as pure and hopeful as the dawn that followed those moonlit walks, with Luc and Camille at the heart of a world they had only just begun to discover. Chapter 2. A whirlwind romance. Luc and Camille's love flourished with the changing seasons, weaving itself into the fabric of their everyday lives. It was a romance that seemed to dance to its own rhythm, with no rush but an unspoken urgency, as if they both knew that such moments were fleeting and precious. Summer faded into autumn, and the city's warmth gave way to a gentle chill, but their feelings for each other only grew stronger. The small rituals they shared became the anchor of their relationship, turning ordinary days into something magical. Camille would often close the bookstore early on Fridays, slipping away from the dusty shelves and the aroma of old pages, to meet Luc on the Pont d'Arts. They would watch as the Seine reflected the gold and crimson hues of sunset, the water shimmering like a living painting beneath their feet. Luc would bring with him a small sketchbook, capturing the city's skyline. But soon, the pages began to fill with sketches of Camille, her profile against the river, the way her hair caught the breeze, the soft curve of her smile. Camille, too, found herself inspired in new ways. Her love of poetry took on a different tone, as she began to see the world through the lens of their shared moments. Her journal, once filled with thoughts of faraway places and abstract musings, now captured the essence of Luc, his steady presence, the depth in his eyes, the way he seemed to make even the most mundane moments feel like poetry. She wrote of their walks through Montmartre's winding streets, the laughter that bubbled up as they stumbled upon hidden cafes, and the quiet comfort of being together, side by side, in a world that felt like their own secret. As the days grew shorter and the first hints of winter crept into the air, Luc and Camille began to talk about their future in their own way. Through gestures, through dreams shared with a glance, they imagined a life beyond the city's noise, a place where they could plant roots, build a home that would grow with their love. On weekends, they took trips to the outskirts of Paris, exploring quiet villages and charming houses nestled amidst fields. Luc could see himself designing a space for them, a home that would be a testament to the life they were building together. Camille imagined filling that space with warmth, with her favorite books and delicate flowers she would pick from their garden. One rainy afternoon, as they wandered through a sleepy town outside the city, Luc spotted a small house tucked between rows of ancient oaks. Its weathered shutters and ivy-covered walls seemed to beckon them. He imagined what it could become. A place where they would share morning coffee on the terrace, where Camille's laughter would fill the rooms, where their future could take root. Camille caught his gaze and followed his thoughts, picturing the house in a new light, imagining herself there with Luc, creating a life filled with moments just like this, simple but endlessly meaningful. It didn't take long before they made their dreams a reality. They found a small, cozy house on the outskirts of Paris, one that seemed to have been waiting just for them. It was nestled at the edge of a quiet village, with a view of open fields that stretched out to meet the sky. The house had a certain charm, with its worn wooden floors and creaking stairs, a space that seemed to echo with history and promise. For Luc and Camille, it was perfect, an empty canvas on which they could paint their new life together. The move marked a new chapter, one that was filled with the thrill of building a home. They spent weekends painting walls, arranging furniture, and turning the house into a space that reflected the best of both of them. Luc's architectural eye found joy in the details, restoring the original beams, designing shelves to hold Camille's ever-growing collection of books, and placing windows to capture the morning light. Camille, in turn, filled the rooms with her warmth, choosing colors that brought out the house's hidden charm, filling it with little touches that spoke of their shared journey. Photos from their travels, pressed flowers from their walks, and the smell of fresh-baked bread on Sunday mornings. Each evening, after the sun dipped below the fields, Luc and Camille would sit together in their new home, wrapped in blankets on the porch, watching as the twilight softened the landscape. They held hands, a quiet acknowledgement of the life they were creating, the small victories that marked their days. The future stretched before them like a quiet road, filled with possibility. They didn't need to say anything to know that they were exactly where they were meant to be. Their days settled into a gentle rhythm, one that felt like the ebb and flow of a river. Luc continued his work in the city, making the commute each day, while Camille found herself embracing the quiet life of the village. She spent her mornings tending to a small garden, a patch of earth where she could plant the flowers she loved. Afternoons were for writing, as she sat by the window with her journal, letting her thoughts drift over the fields. Evenings were their time, when Luc would return home, tired but happy, to find Camille waiting with a smile that felt like coming home. It was a life that felt simple and yet profound, filled with the kind of love that grows in the small moments between the grand gestures. They found joy in the everyday, sharing breakfasts by the window, taking long walks through the countryside, and dreaming about the family they hoped to start one day. Camille's longing for a child began to grow, a quiet hope she carried with her, imagining the laughter of a little one filling the rooms they had so carefully crafted. Luc, too, shared this dream, picturing a future where their family would grow within the walls of the home they had built together. In the stillness of their shared nights, Luc and Camille often reflected on how far they had come since those early days in Paris, when their love was new and fragile. Now, it felt as strong as the oak trees that lined their yard, something that could withstand any storm. They believed that they had found a kind of happiness that few ever experienced, a love that had transformed the shape of their lives, that had given them a place where they could belong. But beneath the surface of their happiness, life continued to weave its threads in unexpected ways. Luc's dedication to his work grew alongside his responsibilities, demanding more of his time and energy, while Camille's yearning for a family began to deepen, creating a tension they had yet to confront. The house they had made their own stood as a testament to their love, a place filled with memories and dreams. But the winds of change were already beginning to stir beyond the horizon. For now, though, Luc and Camille remained blissfully unaware of the trials that lay ahead, wrapped in the warmth of their love and the comfort of their new home. The seasons turned, the fields outside their window shifting from the vibrant greens of summer to the golden hues of autumn, and the couple clung to the belief that their love could weather any season. And so, the days continued, a whirl of moments that felt like eternity, as Luc and Camille built their life together, one heartbeat at a time. Chapter 3: Building Dreams Together. Luc and Camille's life in their new home unfolded like a well-worn map, guiding them through days of quiet contentment and nights of whispered dreams. With each passing season, their love took root deeper into the soil of their shared life. Their days were filled with small joys, like the scent of fresh bread filling the kitchen on a Sunday morning, the gentle hum of the old record player as it played their favorite melodies, or the warmth of the sun filtering through the windows, casting a soft glow on the spaces they had lovingly created. In the mornings, Luc rose early, his mind already buzzing with ideas and plans for his next project. He would slip out of bed, careful not to wake Camille, who slept soundly beside him, wrapped in the warmth of their bed. Luc cherished these quiet moments before the day fully began. Standing by the window with a cup of coffee in hand, watching the first light spread over the fields, painting the landscape in hues of gold. It was in these moments that he found a sense of peace, a reminder of everything they had built together. He often thought of their future, imagining the life that stretched before them, as vast and open as the view from their window. Camille's days followed a gentler rhythm. She would wake to the sound of Luc's car pulling away down the gravel driveway, leaving behind the promise of his return. She'd spend the morning in the garden, tending to the flowers she had planted in neat rows, her hands working through the soil, feeling its cool texture beneath her fingers. Camille had found a new purpose in this quiet life, in the simple act of caring for something that grew beneath her touch. The garden became her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in the rhythm of nature, watching as the flowers bloomed and faded with the seasons. Afternoons were Camille's time for writing. She would settle by the window with her journal, its pages now filled with reflections on their life, thoughts of the past and dreams of the future. The words flowed more easily now, shaped by the tranquility of their new surroundings. Sometimes she wrote about their early days in Paris, capturing the thrill of those first encounters, the rush of new love, and the way they had carved out a space for themselves in a city that never seemed to sleep. Other times, her thoughts turned to the present, to the quiet life they had built together, and the hope that this chapter of their story would last forever. Luc's work often kept him late in the city, his evenings filled with meetings and deadlines that stretched long into the night. But even on those long days, he carried with him the thought of Camille waiting at home, a constant source of comfort and strength. He pushed himself harder, driven by a desire to provide for the life they had envisioned together. His career had become a source of pride, a way to ensure that their dreams could take shape in more than just words. Yet, with each new project, the demands on his time grew, and the weight of his responsibilities settled more heavily on his shoulders. Camille understood the pressures that Luc faced, the ambition that drove him. She admired his dedication, the way he poured himself into his work with the same passion he had once shown for their walks through the city. But as the weeks turned into months, a quiet ache began to settle in her chest, a feeling that she couldn't quite name. She missed the spontaneity of their early days, the ease with which they had once shared their lives. The quiet mornings spent alone began to feel longer, the space between them growing in a way that made her heart ache. Still, Camille kept these feelings to herself, burying them beneath her daily routine. She knew that Luc was doing what he believed was best for them, that his long hours were a sacrifice for their future. And so, she focused on the parts of her life that brought her joy: the garden, the books, the small community she had found in the village. She joined a local art club, where she met others who shared her love of creativity, finding solace in the act of creating something beautiful, even as a sense of longing tugged at the edges of her contentment. Luc, too, sensed a shift between them, but he brushed it aside, telling himself that it was only temporary. He believed that their love was strong enough to weather the strain, that the sacrifices they were making now would be worth it in the end. He took on more projects, pushing for the promotion that he hoped would secure their financial future, dreaming of the day when he could finally slow down, when he and Camille could travel the world as they had always talked about. But in his drive to provide, he missed the quiet signals that Camille's heart was sending. The way her laughter came less easily, the way she lingered by the window, watching for his car to return. Their evenings together became fewer and further between, slipping away like the light at the end of a winter's day. When Luc did come home on time, they would sit together in the living room, sharing a meal that Camille had prepared, the silence between them filled with the soft hum of the old record player. Luc would catch her looking at him sometimes, a sadness in her eyes that he couldn't quite place, but he was too tired to ask, too worn down by the day's work to open the door to those conversations. Instead, he would hold her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze, a silent promise that he was still there, still present, even if the words went unspoken. Camille cherished these moments, fleeting as they were, but the ache inside her continued to grow, like a vine slowly winding its way through her heart. She had always imagined that their love would be enough to carry them through any hardship, that the foundation they had built together would be strong enough to withstand the storms. But now, as she watched Luc become more and more consumed by his work, she began to wonder if she was losing him to a future that she could no longer see. Winter settled over their village, blanketing the fields in a layer of frost, turning the landscape into a world of white and silver. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed to echo with the silence between them, the spaces they had filled together now feeling emptier, colder. Camille found herself spending more time in the garden shed, where she had set up a small space to paint, her brush capturing the muted colors of the season outside. The hours she spent there became her refuge, a way to quiet the thoughts that swirled in her mind, thoughts of the distance that had crept between them like the snow that covered their yard. Luc, too, felt the chill of that distance, even as he tried to ignore it. He buried himself in his work, telling himself that once the promotion came through, once they had the stability they needed, everything would go back to the way it had been. He imagined surprising Camille with a trip, a chance to recapture the magic of their early days, to remind her that he hadn't forgotten the dreams they had shared. But as the days passed, the gap between intention and action widened, until those thoughts became just another promise he made to himself in the quiet of the drive home. And yet, even amid the growing tension, there were moments when the old magic returned. A snowy afternoon spent building a fire together, their hands brushing as they stacked the logs. A quiet evening when Luc came home early and they stood together by the window, watching the snowflakes dance against the glass. Camille leaned her head against his shoulder, and for a moment, the distance between them seemed to melt away, leaving only the warmth of their shared memory, the knowledge that, despite everything, they still loved each other deeply. But those moments were like winter's light, brief, fleeting, and soon swallowed by the longer shadows of night. Luc's promotion finally came through in the new year, bringing with it a sense of accomplishment, but also new responsibilities that demanded even more of his time. Camille celebrated his success, smiling and offering congratulations, but inside, she felt a new weight settle over her heart. She could see the road ahead, and it was one that seemed to stretch further away from the life they had once dreamed of, the one they had built together in that small house on the edge of town. The first cracks in their perfect picture had begun to show, small and barely visible, but they're nonetheless. And as the last snows of winter melted into spring, Luc and Camille faced a new chapter of their lives, one where love and ambition, dreams and reality would begin to collide in ways they had never imagined. Chapter 4. The Drift of Unspoken Longings. As the winter gave way to the first hints of spring, the world outside Luc and Camille's home slowly came back to life. The snow that had blanketed the fields began to recede, revealing patches of new grass, and the trees, bare for so many months, began to show signs of budding leaves. Camille found a sense of comfort in these small changes. She spent more time outside, clearing away the winter's debris from her garden, preparing the soil for new seeds. She relished the earthy scent of the ground, the promise of renewal that each seed held. It was her way of reconnecting with life, a way to hold on to the hope that things could still change for them, that the distance between her and Luc might one day close again. Luc, meanwhile, was immersed in the demands of his new position. The promotion had brought him closer to his professional dreams, but it came at a cost. His days at the office grew longer, his evenings consumed by meetings, client calls, and the constant pressure to perform. He felt the weight of expectation on his shoulders, his own and those of his colleagues, who now looked to him as a leader. There was satisfaction in that, a sense of accomplishment that he had worked so hard to achieve. Yet, at the same time, it left him feeling further from Camille, and from the simpler life they had once imagined. Their evenings together had become a series of passing moments, more like intersections than connections. Luc would come home late, the house quiet except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator or the occasional creak of wood settling in the night. He would find Camille already in bed, the soft light of her bedside lamp casting a warm glow over her face as she read or wrote in her journal. Sometimes he would sit beside her for a while, running a hand through her hair, offering a tired smile before turning away to prepare for another restless night. Camille would close her book, watching his retreating figure, a longing building in her chest that she could not voice. During the weekends, they tried to reclaim some semblance of their old routine. Luc would attempt to finish his work early, and they would set out together for a walk along the river or a visit to the nearby town. But even these outings had changed. Where once they had shared a sense of discovery, now there was a silence that stretched between them, filled with unspoken words and quiet questions. Camille found herself wishing that Luc would see how much she needed him, that he would recognize the ache she carried. But Luc, so wrapped up in the whirlwind of his new responsibilities, missed the subtle signs that she gave, misinterpreting her quietness as contentment rather than the loneliness it truly was. As the weeks turned into months, the distance between them became harder to ignore. Camille poured her energy into the garden, losing herself in the rhythm of planting, weeding, and tending to the small buds that emerged with the warming sun. She found solace in the predictability of nature, in the certainty that, with care, the flowers would bloom. It became her way of coping with the growing uncertainty in her marriage, with the sense that she and Luc were no longer moving through life together, but rather alongside each other, like two parallel paths that never quite touched. Luc, on the other hand, threw himself even more deeply into his work. He convinced himself that his dedication would eventually pay off, that once he had established himself in this new role, he would be able to give Camille the time and attention she deserved. He believed that this phase of distance was a temporary hardship, a necessary sacrifice for a future that would be better for both of them. But each time he pushed back a trip they had planned or came home too late for dinner, a small part of him wondered if he was making the right choice. If, in striving for success, he was losing sight of what had once been most important to him. Camille could sense Luc's internal struggle, even if he never spoke of it. She saw it in the way he would pause in the doorway, as if unsure of whether to enter the room, or in the way he sometimes glanced at her with a look that seemed to carry 1,000 unasked questions. She wanted to reach out to him, to tell him how much she missed the man he had been, how much she missed the warmth that had once filled their home. But every time she opened her mouth to speak, the words seemed to catch in her throat, trapped by a fear that speaking them aloud would make the distance between them feel even more real. Instead, Camille sought comfort in her journals, writing late into the night when she couldn't sleep. Her entries became a refuge, a place where she could pour out her worries and her dreams, her frustrations and her hopes. She wrote of the early days of their marriage, of the love they had shared and the life they had built together. She wrote about her fear that the life they had envisioned was slipping away from them, that they were becoming strangers to each other, even as they shared the same bed. And she wrote about the quiet ache that settled in her chest each time Luc turned away from her, lost in his own world. One evening, as Luc sat in his study, catching up on work, Camille found herself lingering by the door. She watched him from the shadows, taking in the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, the way he barely seemed to notice the passing of time. She thought about how much he had changed, how much they both had changed, and a sense of loss washed over her, as deep and cold as the river they used to walk along. She wondered if he, too, felt the weight of everything that had gone unspoken between them, if he sensed the fragility of the life they had built, now straining under the weight of unmet needs and unshared dreams. That night, as Camille lay in bed, she thought about the things she had never said, the parts of herself she had kept hidden, believing that love would be enough to carry them through. She thought about the days when Luc would come home with flowers, when they would dance in the living room, wrapped in each other's arms, and she wondered if those days were truly gone, or if they could find their way back to that place. A part of her still believed that they could, that the love they had once shared was strong enough to weather even this storm. But as she listened to the sound of Luc's footsteps in the hallway, heading not toward their bedroom but back to his study, she felt a crack form in that hope, as small and sharp as a piece of broken glass. Luc, too, lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of his study, his mind too full of thoughts to allow for sleep. He thought about the life they had built in that small house on the edge of town, about the promises they had made to each other when they were young and full of dreams. He thought about Camille's quiet smile, the way she used to laugh at his jokes, and how long it had been since he had heard that sound. He knew that he was failing her in some way, that his work had become a wall between them, but he didn't know how to tear it down, didn't know how to bridge the gap that had grown between their hearts. He told himself that he would try harder, that he would find a way to balance the demands of his career with the needs of their marriage. But each time he resolved to change, the next morning brought new emails, new meetings, new deadlines that swept him away into the relentless current of his responsibilities. And so, the promises he made in the quiet hours of the night remained unfulfilled, slipping away like the early light of dawn. Spring deepened, and the garden outside their window began to flourish, a riot of colors and blooms that should have brought a sense of renewal. But for Luc and Camille, the seasons turned without bringing the changes they most needed. The flowers that Camille had planted swayed in the warm breeze, their petals bright and open to the sun, while inside, a colder wind seemed to settle between them, leaving both of them feeling more alone than they could admit, even to themselves. As April turned to May, the first cracks in their marriage deepened, like fractures in a glass that had once been whole. Camille continued to write, to tend to her garden, to hope that somehow things would change. Luc continued to work, to push forward, to dream of a future where everything might fall back into place. And yet, with each passing day, they drifted further apart, like two ships caught in the same current but moving in opposite directions, each one wondering how they had ended up so far from the shore they had once called home. Chapter 5. A New Beginning. The early days of summer arrived, bringing long, sun-drenched evenings and the hum of insects filling the air around the small house where Luc and Camille lived. Outside, the garden that Camille had carefully nurtured all spring had blossomed into a vibrant display, with rows of flowers leaning into the sun, their bright colors splashing against the green backdrop of the trees. To any outsider, it might have seemed like a place of peace and renewal, a small haven of life and beauty. But inside the house, the growing tension between Luc and Camille cast a shadow over even the brightest days. Luc's time at work became even more consuming. His company had taken on a new project, and he was leading the charge, putting in hours that stretched late into the night. Meetings multiplied, phone calls became endless, and the pressure to succeed hung over him like a storm cloud that refused to drift away. At first, he had thought that this success would bring satisfaction, that each milestone achieved would feel like a step towards something greater. But as the demands of the job piled up, he found himself growing weary, even resentful of the way his life seemed to revolve around tasks and deadlines. There were moments when Luc would glance at his reflection in the office windows late at night, seeing the man he had become, drawn, tense, his face lined with exhaustion, and he would remember the simpler, younger version of himself. He thought about the man who had met Camille with wide-eyed excitement, who had shared spontaneous adventures and lazy Sunday mornings with her, who had dreamed of a life filled with passion and exploration. Now, that version of Luc felt like a distant stranger, someone who had been left behind somewhere along the path he had chosen. Camille, on the other hand, felt the shift between them like a slow, creeping chill. She tried to fill her days with purpose, pouring herself into the small joys she could still find. She spent more time in the garden, coaxing new blooms from the earth, as if each flower that opened could bridge the widening gap between her and Luc. She took long walks through the nearby woods, listening to the whisper of leaves in the breeze and the gentle rustle of the underbrush, hoping that the calm of nature might seep into her heart and ease the ache that had settled there. Yet, no matter how hard she tried to find solace in her solitude, the emptiness she felt in the house, in their life together, remained. She missed the way Luc used to look at her, the way his eyes would light up when he spoke of his dreams. She missed the feeling of being truly seen, of being cherished for who she was, not just as someone who shared his home, but as a partner, a confidant, a friend. In their quietest moments, when she lay awake beside him, listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing, she wondered if he still thought of her that way, or if she had become just another fixture in the life he was building, something that could be taken for granted, like the walls of their home or the routines of their days. Their interactions became increasingly stilted, shaped more by habit than by genuine connection. They moved through their mornings like two actors playing roles they had long since memorized. Luc would pour himself a cup of coffee, Camille would prepare breakfast, and they would sit together at the table, eating in a silence that had grown heavy with unspoken thoughts. Luc's mind was often already at the office, thinking of the day's agenda, while Camille watched the shadows shift across the walls, wondering if this was what the rest of their lives would look like. Endless days of drifting through the same motions, with no room left for the love that had once defined them. As the heat of summer deepened, Camille found herself retreating more and more into her own world, carving out small spaces of time that were hers alone. She began to visit a nearby lake, driving out in the early mornings before the heat became oppressive, sitting by the water's edge with her thoughts. There, she would watch the sunlight dance on the surface of the lake, the ripples creating patterns that shimmered like a mirage. She thought about the life she had envisioned when she had married Luc, the dreams they had woven together in the quiet of their first nights as husband and wife. She wondered how they had come to this place where everything felt so distant, where even their shared home seemed like a shell of the life they had hoped to build. Luc, too, began to sense the deepening gulf between them, even if he couldn't find the words to express it. There were nights when he would come home, exhausted from another grueling day, and find Camille sitting on the porch, staring out at the sky as the last rays of daylight faded into dusk. He would watch her for a moment before heading inside, feeling an unfamiliar ache twist in his chest. He wanted to reach out to her, to ask her what she was thinking, to tell her that he was struggling too, that he missed the warmth they had once shared. But the words never came. Instead, he would retreat to his study, telling himself that there would be time to talk later, that things would improve once the pressures of work eased. Yet, the pressures never seemed to ease, and the moments that might have brought them back together slipped by, one after another, like grains of sand falling through an hourglass. Camille continued to visit the lake, finding solace in its stillness, while Luc continued to lose himself in his work, each of them moving through their own separate orbits. They had become like two planets, revolving around the same sun but never quite crossing paths, each one caught in a gravitational pull that kept them apart. In these long summer days, Camille found herself growing closer to Paul, an old friend who had always been a comforting presence in her life. Paul had a way of listening that made her feel understood, even when she couldn't articulate all the complexities of her heart. They met by chance at the local market one afternoon, and from there, their paths began to cross more frequently. Paul, with his easy smile and his gentle humor, became a lifeline for Camille, a reminder that she was still seen, that her thoughts and feelings mattered. He asked her about the things she loved, about her garden, about the books she read and the places she dreamed of visiting. He seemed to notice the parts of her that Luc had grown blind to, and for the first time in months, Camille felt a flicker of something she had thought long lost, a sense of being alive, of being understood. Luc remained unaware of the shift that was taking place within Camille, wrapped up as he was in the endless stream of work. He noticed that she seemed more distant, that she often left the house without explanation, but he attributed it to the natural rhythms of their lives, believing that they were simply adjusting to the changes that time had brought. He trusted that the love they had shared was strong enough to withstand the strain, that they would find their way back to each other eventually. But he didn't see the way Camille's eyes lit up when she spoke with Paul, or the way her laughter had returned in those moments spent away from home. He didn't see the way she looked at him now, with a sadness that bordered on resignation, as if she had already begun to mourn the loss of something she couldn't bring herself to name. As summer stretched on, the air between them grew thicker with things unsaid. Camille continued to visit the lake, to spend time with Paul, even as a part of her knew that she was drifting further from the life she had built with Luc. She told herself that it was innocent, that Paul was just a friend, that she was simply seeking a connection that had faded in her marriage. But beneath that rationalization lay a deeper truth that she was afraid to face, that she was beginning to find in Paul the companionship she had once sought in Luc, the warmth she had thought lost forever. Luc, meanwhile, worked late into the evenings, convinced that his efforts would eventually pay off, that he was doing what was best for their future. He didn't see the cracks that had formed in the foundation of their marriage, or perhaps he chose not to see them, hoping that if he ignored them long enough, they would disappear. But each time he came home to an empty house, each time he found Camille already asleep or gone somewhere without explanation, a part of him felt a pang of doubt, a sense that something precious was slipping away from him. In those quiet moments, as the sun set over their home and the cicadas sang their mournful song, Luc and Camille each found themselves staring into the darkness, feeling the weight of what had gone unspoken between them. They both held on to the hope that things might still change, that the love they had once shared could be rekindled. Yet, neither of them knew how to take the first step back toward each other, how to bridge the gap that had grown so wide and deep. And so, the summer continued, with its warm nights and bright days, its hidden heartaches and unspoken truths, carrying them both further from the life they had once imagined and closer to a crossroads they could not yet see. Chapter 6. The Fragility of Hope. The days slowly rolled into the heat of August, the sun bearing down heavily on the town where Luc and Camille's lives seemed to drift further apart with each passing moment. The garden, which had once flourished under Camille's attentive care, began to show signs of neglect. Weeds crept between the flower beds, and the once vibrant blooms that had brought color to their home now wilted under the relentless summer sun. It was as if the garden itself mirrored the state of their marriage, a place that had once thrived, now struggling to hold onto its former beauty. Camille spent more time away from the house, seeking out the solace of the lake and the quiet companionship of Paul. There, by the water's edge, she felt a strange sense of relief, a temporary reprieve from the guilt and confusion that clouded her mind. She would sit with Paul on the sun-warmed rocks, watching the ripples dance across the surface of the water, listening to the gentle lapping of the waves. Paul had a way of filling the silence with his presence, a quiet assurance that allowed Camille to breathe again, to feel like herself. Yet, as much as Camille found comfort in Paul's company, a knot of guilt twisted inside her with every visit. She knew that these moments by the lake, these smiles and lingering touches, had crossed an invisible line, one that she had never thought herself capable of crossing. But every time she returned home to the house she shared with Luc, every time she saw the weary lines etched into his face, she felt that knot tighten further. It was as if she were carrying the weight of two lives, one marked by duty and unfulfilled promises, the other by a fragile sense of freedom that she dared not fully embrace. Luc remained oblivious to the true depth of Camille's inner struggle. He was caught in the current of his own battles, fighting to keep his head above the mounting responsibilities that came with his job. His promotion had seemed like a victory, a sign that all his hard work was finally paying off, but now it felt more like a chain that kept pulling him further from the life he had once imagined. There were days when he could barely recall what had drawn him to this path, what had made him believe that success in his career would translate into happiness at home. The long hours began to take their toll on Luc's body and mind. He often woke before dawn, his mind already racing with thoughts of the day ahead, and collapsed into bed long after Camille had fallen asleep. His sleep was restless, filled with dreams that left him waking in a cold sweat, his heart pounding with an unnamed dread. He would lie awake in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, feeling the quiet distance that stretched between him and Camille even when they were lying side by side. He thought of reaching out to her, of finding the words that could bridge the silence, but each time he opened his mouth, the words dissolved on his tongue. Camille noticed the toll that Luc's job was taking on him. She saw the dark circles under his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped with exhaustion when he returned home each night. She saw how he would stand at the kitchen sink, staring out the window as if searching for something that lay just beyond his reach. And for a moment, a flicker of the old concern she once felt for him surfaced in her chest. She wondered if they might still find a way back to each other, if there was a path that could lead them out of the maze they had become trapped in. But the distance between them felt like a vast ocean now, with waves of resentment and unspoken pain washing over any attempts to reconnect. Camille couldn't forget the years of feeling invisible, of watching Luc's ambition consume the space that had once been theirs. And Luc, for his part, couldn't shake the feeling that Camille had slipped beyond his grasp, that she had changed in ways he could not understand, becoming a stranger even as they lived under the same roof. They had grown so accustomed to the patterns of their distance that neither of them knew how to break free of them. As the summer continued, the moments when their paths did cross became increasingly strained. Luc would come home to find Camille sitting in the living room, a book in her lap, her gaze distant as if she were seeing something far beyond the walls of their home. He would stand in the doorway for a moment, watching her, feeling a pang of something like loss twist inside him. He would open his mouth, intending to ask her how her day had been, but instead he would find himself muttering a brief greeting before disappearing into his study. Camille, sensing his presence before he even spoke, would force herself to offer him a tired smile, a small gesture that never quite reached her eyes. One evening, Luc came home to find the house empty. Camille had left a note on the kitchen counter, a few lines scribbled hastily, explaining that she had gone to visit a friend. The words felt like a slap in the face, a reminder that she had begun to carve out a life that no longer included him. He crumpled the note in his fist, anger flaring in his chest, but beneath that anger lay a deeper, more painful emotion: fear. He feared that she was slipping away from him, that the woman he had once known so intimately had become someone he could no longer reach. That night, Luc stood in the darkened living room, looking at the photographs that lined the walls, pictures of their early days together, smiling faces captured in moments of joy that now felt like relics of a time long past. He traced his fingers over the glass, over the image of Camille laughing in the sunlight, her eyes crinkled with happiness. He wondered if they could ever find their way back to that place, if there was still a chance to save what they had built, or if they were already too far gone. Meanwhile, Camille sat beside Paul by the lake, watching the last light of day fade into the water. She felt the warmth of Paul's hand resting beside hers, so close that their fingers nearly touched. There was a comfort in his presence, a sense of ease that she hadn't felt in so long, but it was tempered by a constant undercurrent of guilt. She thought of Luc back at home, of the life they had once imagined together, and the pain of that thought gnawed at her, even as she leaned into the solace of this stolen moment. She knew that she was standing on a precipice, that her heart was caught between two conflicting desires: the desire to honor the love she had once shared with Luc, and the desire to find happiness for herself, however fleeting. As the days continued, Luc and Camille remained locked in this painful limbo, each of them struggling with their own fears and regrets. Luc buried himself deeper into his work, telling himself that he was doing it for their future, even as he felt the threads that bound him to Camille fraying with each passing day. Camille found herself drawn more and more to the lake, to the sense of peace she found there. But she could not ignore the voice inside her that warned her of the consequences of the path she was walking. Their lives became a balancing act, with each of them trying to maintain the fragile illusion that things might still be salvaged, even as the cracks in their relationship grew wider. Luc would bring home small gifts for Camille, leaving them on the kitchen table without a word, as if trying to remind her of the love they had once shared. Camille would place the gifts on a shelf, staring at them with a mix of gratitude and sorrow, wondering if these gestures could ever be enough to heal the wounds that had grown between them. And yet, for all their attempts to hold on, the distance continued to widen, pulling them further into their own separate worlds. Luc found himself standing outside the house late at night, looking up at the stars and wondering where they had gone wrong, while Camille lay awake in their bed, feeling the weight of her decisions pressing down on her chest like a stone. Each of them held a hope that seemed to grow dimmer with each passing day, a hope that they might still find a way to mend the broken pieces of their love, even as they feared that the damage had already become too great. As summer began to wane, the days grew shorter, the air taking on the first hints of autumn's chill. The garden, once vibrant and alive, began to wither, its blooms fading one by one. Luc and Camille moved through the last days of the season like ghosts, haunted by the shadows of what they had lost, clinging to a fragile hope that neither of them could bring themselves to speak. And all the while, the distance between them stretched on, an unbridgeable chasm that left them standing on opposite shores, each of them staring into the darkness, wondering if they had already reached the point of no return. Chapter 7. The Breaking Point. Autumn settled over the town like a blanket of rust and gold, the leaves turning brilliant shades before drifting to the ground in brittle piles. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of wood smoke from chimneys and the promise of the colder months to come. For most, this was a season of nostalgia, a time for cozy evenings and harvest celebrations. But for Luc and Camille, the change in season only seemed to deepen the chill that had settled between them, drawing them further into the private worlds of their unspoken grief and unfulfilled longing. Luc's workdays continued to stretch endlessly, each one bleeding into the next until he could no longer remember the last time he had truly felt rested. His promotion, once a point of pride, now felt like a weight that had become too heavy to carry. The demands of his job pressed down on him like an iron hand, leaving him with little energy for anything beyond the office walls. He found himself staying later and later, lingering in the sterile glow of his desk lamp, surrounded by stacks of paperwork that never seemed to diminish. It was easier, he told himself, to lose himself in the grind than to return to the silence of the house, where every empty room echoed with reminders of what they had once shared. At home, Camille moved through the days like a ghost, her movements slow and methodical. She took up old hobbies in an attempt to fill the quiet, painting on the back porch, knitting scarves she had no intention of wearing, baking loaves of bread that she would leave untouched on the kitchen counter. But nothing seemed to ease the restlessness that gnawed at her, the sense that she was living a life that no longer felt like her own. She would sit by the window for hours, watching the wind tug at the leaves outside, her thoughts drifting back to the person she had once been, so full of hope and eager for the future. In the afternoons, when Luc was still at work, Camille would take long walks through the town, tracing familiar routes through streets lined with old stone houses and the fading remnants of summer gardens. She visited the small cafe where they had shared their first date, lingering over a cup of coffee as she stared at the corner table where they had sat, laughing and talking about everything that felt important then. It seemed like a lifetime ago now, those early days when they had believed that love alone could be enough to carry them through whatever life might bring. Sometimes, her walks took her back to the lake, where she would find Paul waiting by the water's edge, his gaze softening when he saw her approach. They no longer tried to disguise the way their hands would brush against each other, or the way they leaned closer when they spoke. But even in these moments of closeness, Camille felt a growing unease. She could not escape the awareness that what they shared was built on the crumbling foundation of her marriage, that it existed in the shadows of a life she had once promised to Luc. And as much as she longed for the comfort that Paul offered, a part of her feared what might happen if Luc ever discovered the truth. One evening, as Luc drove home from the office, the first drops of rain began to splatter against his windshield. The sky, which had been clear that morning, was now awash of dark clouds, rolling in from the west like a tide. He watched the rain blur the familiar streets, his thoughts swirling like the storm gathering outside. He thought of Camille's distant smiles, the way her eyes no longer seemed to light up when he walked into a room. He thought of the space between them at night, the cold emptiness that seemed to stretch across their bed, and the way she would turn away from him, her back a barrier he no longer knew how to cross. By the time he reached their street, the rain had turned into a downpour, soaking the town in sheets of water that reflected the glow of streetlights. Luc parked in the driveway, his mind a storm of unvoiced questions and the creeping suspicion that something had changed in a way he could not quite name. He sat in the car for a long time, listening to the drumming of the rain on the roof, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle deep into his bones. When he finally stepped out into the rain, it felt like he was crossing a threshold, stepping into a night that would change everything. Inside, the house was dark, save for the faint glow from the living room lamp. Camille was sitting on the couch, a book open on her lap, but her eyes were distant, staring into the shadows beyond the pages. She didn't seem to notice Luc's entrance, her thoughts lost somewhere far away. Luc stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, feeling a strange mix of love and resentment twist inside him. He wanted to reach out to her, to shake her free from whatever held her so far from him, but instead, he simply turned and retreated to the quiet of his study. As the rain beat against the windows, the house seemed to hold its breath, as if sensing the tension that coiled through its rooms. Luc sat at his desk, staring at the framed photographs on the wall, images of a life that no longer felt like his own. He traced the outline of Camille's face in one of the pictures, taken on a trip to the countryside years ago, her smile wide and carefree. He remembered how they had walked through the fields together, hand in hand, dreaming of the family they would one day have. But those dreams had withered, replaced by the quiet bitterness that now marked their days. In the living room, Camille closed her book, the words blurring in her vision. She thought of the hours she had spent with Paul by the lake, the way he had held her hand when she felt like she might drown in her own sorrow. But she also thought of Luc, of the man he had been before the weight of his ambitions had driven a wedge between them. She knew that there was no easy answer, no path that would allow her to keep both the comfort of Paul's presence and the history she shared with Luc. And as much as she tried to deny it, a part of her still clung to the hope that somehow, she and Luc might find a way back to each other. The storm raged on through the night, the wind howling around the corners of the house, as if trying to tear away the fragile walls they had built between themselves and the world outside. Luc sat in his study, his mind racing with thoughts of the life they had lost, while Camille lay awake in the darkness of their bedroom, listening to the sound of the rain against the windows. The silence between them grew heavier, pressing down on their hearts, making it hard to breathe. They had become strangers to each other, bound together by memories that now seemed like fragments of a story that no longer belonged to them. As dawn broke, the rain finally eased, leaving behind a world washed clean by the storm. The first light of morning crept through the curtains, casting a pale glow across the room. Camille rose from the bed, her footsteps quiet on the wooden floor as she made her way to the window. She watched the rainwater drip from the eaves, cooling in the flower beds below, and felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. She knew that the time for pretending was over, that she could no longer ignore the cracks that had fractured their marriage, no matter how much it hurt to face them. Luc, emerging from his study with heavy eyes, found Camille standing by the window, her silhouette framed by the morning light. He paused, watching her, feeling a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Regret, perhaps, or the fear that he had waited too long to try and make things right. He took a step toward her, but stopped short, unsure of what to say or do. Instead, he turned away, heading toward the kitchen to prepare coffee, each movement a ritual that offered a momentary distraction from the ache in his chest. And so, the morning passed in a fragile truce, both of them moving through the house like sleepwalkers, avoiding the deeper truths that lingered in the air between them. They shared breakfast at the kitchen table, but the food tasted like ash in their mouths, and their eyes never quite met. Camille thought of the day ahead, of the choices that lay before her, and wondered if she had the strength to face them. Luc, glancing at the clock, tried to summon the energy to face another day at the office, but all he could think about was the question that had haunted him through the night: whether it was too late to find a way back to the life they had lost. By the time Luc left for work, the sky had cleared, the last of the storm clouds retreating beyond the hills. Camille watched him drive away, a knot of uncertainty tightening in her chest. She thought of the lake, of Paul's waiting smile, and wondered if today would be the day she finally found the courage to make a decision. And as she stood in the doorway of their home, feeling the cool autumn breeze brush against her skin, she realized that no matter what path she chose, something within her would be left behind. Just as the remnants of the storm still lingered in the air, even as the world began to dry beneath the morning sun. Chapter 8. A Growing Distance. The days moved forward with a deceptive ease, the kind that masks a growing fracture just below the surface. Luc and Camille went through the motions of their lives as if their marriage were still intact, but both felt the tension that underlined every interaction, the barely concealed hurt that simmered beneath each shared moment. The unspoken truths between them had grown into an invisible wall, a barricade they could neither see over nor break down. Luc buried himself even deeper in his work, arriving at the office earlier and leaving later than ever. His colleagues noticed the change, his quiet intensity, the way he threw himself into every task as if trying to outrun something unseen. The office became his refuge, a place where he could focus on concrete goals and measurable outcomes instead of the uncertain territory of his home life. His reputation for being a driven and meticulous worker only grew, yet inside, he felt like he was moving through life with blinders on, unable to see anything beyond the next task, the next deadline. On the weekends, when he couldn't use work as an excuse, Luc would find other projects to occupy his time. Fixing the loose floorboards on the porch, repainting the garden fence, repairing the gutters that always seemed to clog after a rainstorm. He would lose himself in the rhythm of physical labor, hoping that the scrape of a paintbrush or the steady thud of a hammer would drown out the silence that followed him through the house. But it didn't matter how many hours he spent sanding, nailing, or scrubbing. The emptiness always returned, lurking in the quiet corners of their home, waiting to remind him of all that had been lost. Meanwhile, Camille found herself turning more often to her walks, drifting through the town like a leaf caught in a slow-moving current. She revisited old haunts, the bookstore where she had spent so many afternoons, the little park where she and Luc had once picnicked on warm summer days. But each place felt changed, stripped of its warmth, as if the memories they had once shared had been covered in a layer of frost. The bookstore felt colder, the park lonelier, and the town itself seemed to hold its breath whenever she passed through its familiar streets. Camille's visits to the lake became her most consistent ritual, a place where she could let her guard down without fear of judgment. Paul was always there, waiting with a sympathetic presence that she had come to depend on, even if she no longer allowed herself to linger in his embrace for too long. They would sit side by side on the bench overlooking the water, the autumn wind stirring the reeds along the shore, and Camille would pour out her worries in a voice that never quite reached the level of speech. Half-formed thoughts, carried away by the breeze. Paul would listen, his expression softened by an understanding that was free of the weight of expectations. But even in these moments, Camille felt the pull of a different kind of guilt, a gnawing awareness that she was living in the space between two lives, unable to fully commit to either. It was on one of these walks that she first noticed the way Paul's eyes lingered on her, a mixture of concern and something more that he couldn't quite hide. She sensed his growing hope, the belief that perhaps they could become something more than the refuge they had found in each other's company. But that hope frightened her. As much as she had come to rely on Paul's presence, she could not bring herself to imagine a life with him that wasn't shadowed by what she had lost with Luc. The very thought made her feel as if she were standing at the edge of a precipice, looking down into an uncertain future. Back at home, Luc was becoming increasingly aware of Camille's absences, though he never confronted her about them. He noticed the way she seemed more distracted, how her gaze would drift out the window as if searching for something that wasn't there. He found himself wondering where she went on those long walks, whether she found solace in places he no longer had access to. But he buried those questions, unwilling to face the answers he feared. Instead, he focused on keeping his routine steady, as if the predictability of his days could somehow shield him from the growing sense that his life was slipping out of his control. The distance between them deepened, each of them retreating further into their separate worlds. Camille found herself spending more time in the spare bedroom she had converted into a makeshift studio, painting canvases that were filled with abstract swirls of color: red, blue, gray, and black. Images that reflected the turmoil she felt but could not articulate. The paintings began to pile up, each one a silent record of her frustration, her confusion, her longing for something she could not quite define. She rarely showed them to anyone, keeping them hidden in the back of the room like secrets she was afraid to reveal. Luc, on the other hand, began to lose himself in memories. He would find himself standing in front of old photo albums, thumbing through pictures from their early days together, images of their honeymoon, of road trips through the French countryside, of lazy Sunday mornings in their first apartment. He would linger over these photos, tracing the outline of Camille's smile with his finger, wondering where that version of her had gone. But the more he looked back, the more he felt as though he were staring at a stranger's life, one that had nothing to do with the present. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at the office, Luc came home to find the house empty. Camille's coat was missing from the hook by the door, and her car was gone from the driveway. He wandered through the silent rooms, the sound of his own footsteps echoing off the walls. He made himself a simple dinner, eating alone at the kitchen table, his mind churning with unasked questions. As the hours ticked by and the sky outside darkened, a knot of anxiety began to tighten in his chest. He paced the length of the hallway, pausing every few minutes to peer out the window, searching for any sign of headlights approaching the drive. But Camille did not return until late that night, slipping into the house with footsteps so quiet they barely made a sound. Luc heard the door close and the soft rustle of her coat as she hung it up in the darkened hallway. He remained in the shadows of their bedroom, listening as she climbed the stairs, feeling the distance between them like a physical presence in the room. He thought of the long hours he had spent worrying, the questions that had clawed at his mind, and felt a surge of anger mingled with a profound sense of helplessness. But he said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch between them, thick and impenetrable. For Camille, the night marked a turning point, a realization that she could no longer continue living in this limbo. She lay awake beside Luc, staring up at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything that had gone unsaid pressing down on her chest. She thought of Paul's patient smile, of the quiet warmth she found in his company, and wondered whether she was being selfish for wanting more than the life she shared with Luc. But she also thought of Luc himself, of the way he had once made her feel safe, cherished, understood. She knew that whatever choice she made, someone would be hurt, and the thought of that pain kept her rooted in place, unable to move forward or backward. In the weeks that followed, the tension between them only grew more palpable, like a wire pulled taut between two hands. Luc found himself scrutinizing Camille's every action, searching for clues to the distance he sensed but could not name. He began to wonder if there was someone else, a suspicion that cut him deeply even as he tried to dismiss it. He told himself that Camille was just going through a phase, that they could still find their way back to each other. But deep down, he knew that something essential had changed. Camille, for her part, grew increasingly aware of Luc's watchful eyes, the way he seemed to hover on the edge of asking questions he was too afraid to voice. She tried to bridge the gap between them, making small gestures, cooking his favorite meals, suggesting they go for walks together. But each attempt felt hollow, weighed down by the unspoken truths that lingered between them. She thought of telling him everything, of laying bare her feelings and her fears, but every time she opened her mouth, the words caught in her throat, refusing to take shape. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, and their home became a place of unspoken pain, a liminal space between what had been and what could no longer be. The love that had once burned so brightly between them now flickered like a dying ember, struggling to hold onto its last traces of warmth. And though they both felt the weight of that loss, neither could find the courage to confront it directly, leaving them trapped in a spiral of unspoken questions and unanswered hopes, as the life they had built together continued to crumble around them. Chapter 9. The Accident. As winter set in, the cold crept into every corner of Luc and Camille's life, echoing the chill that had settled between them. Frost covered the windows of their small house, creating delicate patterns on the glass that melted away with the morning sun, much like the fragile connection they still clung to. Outside, the trees had shed their leaves, standing bare and stark against a gray sky, as if nature itself had given up on the warmth and vitality that once filled their lives. Luc's routine became even more rigid, his days blending into one another with a mechanical precision that left little room for introspection. He awoke before dawn, moving through the house with the careful, muted steps of a man trying not to disturb the delicate balance that kept their life from falling apart. He would prepare his coffee in silence, watching the steam rise from his mug, lost in thoughts that he couldn't fully articulate even to himself. He avoided looking at the photos on the mantel, those frozen moments from their past that now seemed to belong to another era, a distant memory that felt more like a dream than reality. The office became his true home, a place where the weight of his strained marriage could be temporarily set aside. Luc's colleagues had stopped asking about Camille, their initial curiosity about his long hours replaced by a quiet respect for the boundaries he had erected around his private life. He took on new projects with a fervor that bordered on obsession, losing himself in spreadsheets and reports, immersing himself in meetings where he could speak of numbers and strategies rather than face the growing emptiness within him. Yet, despite his best efforts, he could not entirely escape the gnawing awareness that his home life was unraveling, thread by thread. Camille, meanwhile, withdrew further into herself, her walks along the lakeshore growing longer and more aimless. She no longer found the solace she once did in nature's embrace. Instead, each step felt like an exercise in avoidance, a way of keeping herself in motion so she would not have to confront the stillness that awaited her back home. The sight of the lake's frozen surface, once a source of tranquility, now seemed like a metaphor for her life, a layer of ice concealing the turbulent currents beneath. The wind cut through her coat, bringing tears to her eyes, but she welcomed the sting, letting it remind her that she was still capable of feeling something, anything, amidst the numbness. Paul's presence in her life had become a secret she guarded fiercely, but even that connection had changed. Their meetings at the lake had grown sporadic, tinged with an awkwardness that neither of them acknowledged directly. Camille sensed Paul's unspoken frustration, his desire for something more than stolen moments on the lakeshore, and she knew that he struggled to understand why she remained tethered to a marriage that brought her so much pain. But she couldn't bring herself to explain it to him, just as she couldn't bring herself to leave Luc. She clung to her marriage like a lifeline, even as she felt it dragging her deeper into a sea of uncertainty. Back in the house, Luc began to notice small changes in Camille's behavior. Little things that might have gone unnoticed in the past, but now felt like clues to a mystery he could not solve. He noticed how she lingered longer over her coffee, staring out the window as if searching for something beyond the frost-covered pane. He saw the way she flinched when their hands brushed accidentally, as if the contact burned her. He heard her footsteps moving through the house late at night, restless and aimless, as if she were searching for a place where she could finally feel at ease. Luc's own sense of isolation deepened. He spent long hours at his desk, staring at financial reports that blurred into meaningless numbers. He tried to find solace in the familiar rhythm of work, but the satisfaction he had once drawn from his professional accomplishments now felt hollow. The promotions, the accolades, they all seemed like empty prizes compared to the void that had opened up between him and the woman he had once loved with every fiber of his being. He thought of the days when they would plan their weekends together, when they would talk about the places they wanted to visit, the dreams they held for their future. But now, those conversations were just echoes in the vast silence that had grown between them. At night, the silence in their home was nearly unbearable. They had taken to eating dinner in near-complete quiet, the clinking of cutlery against plates filling the space where their conversations used to live. Camille would push her food around her plate, her thoughts drifting to places Luc could not follow, while Luc would glance up occasionally, catching glimpses of her downturned face. He thought of reaching out to her, of saying something, anything, that might bridge the chasm between them. But each time he opened his mouth, the words died in his throat, swallowed by a fear he could not fully name. Camille found herself retreating more often to her makeshift studio, the room filled with half-finished canvases that had begun to pile up against the walls. The act of painting had become a kind of ritual, a way of releasing the emotions she could not express in words. Her brushstrokes grew bolder, more chaotic, as if she were trying to capture the dissonance she felt inside. The canvases that emerged were dark and turbulent, filled with swirling shapes that seemed to fight for dominance, struggling to break free from the confines of the frame. She would paint late into the night, her body moving with a feverish energy, as if the act of creation could somehow stave off the creeping sense of loss that threatened to engulf her. One particularly frigid evening, Luc returned home to find Camille standing in the studio, her back to him, her hands covered in streaks of blue and black paint. He paused in the doorway, watching as she attacked the canvas with fierce, unrestrained strokes. Her shoulders were tense, her entire frame radiating a kind of desperation that he had never seen before. For a moment, he was struck by the realization that he did not recognize this version of her. The woman who had once shared her dreams with him, who had laughed with him beneath the warmth of the sun, seemed to have vanished, leaving behind a stranger consumed by her own private turmoil. Luc wanted to reach out, to ask her what was wrong, but the sight of her intensity held him back. He retreated from the doorway, leaving her alone in her world of colors and shadows, feeling like a trespasser in his own home. He went to bed that night with a heaviness in his chest, lying awake long after Camille had finally joined him, her breathing uneven and restless beside him. He thought of all the things he had failed to say, the questions he had not asked, and wondered whether it was too late to find their way back to each other. The winter dragged on, the days turning into weeks, then months, each one colder than the last. The snow piled up along the edges of the roads, and the town seemed to slip into a state of hibernation, as if bracing itself against the chill. Luc and Camille moved through their routines like actors performing roles they no longer believed in. Their interactions reduced to a series of mechanical gestures, passing each other the salt at dinner, folding laundry in silence, sharing a bed without ever touching. Camille's meetings with Paul grew increasingly infrequent, their conversations marked by a strained politeness that spoke of unresolved tension. She felt the weight of his unspoken questions, the way his gaze lingered on her when she spoke of Luc, but she could not bring herself to answer him. The comfort she had once found in his presence was fading, replaced by a sense of unease that gnawed at her every time she met his eyes. She knew that Paul deserved more than the half-hearted affection she could offer, just as she knew that Luc deserved more than the quiet resentment that had become their new normal. But she felt trapped, caught between the remnants of her past and the uncertain promise of something new. Luc, on the other hand, grew more withdrawn with each passing day. He found himself avoiding the places that reminded him of their happier times together. No more visits to the park where they had picnicked, no more walks along the river where they had once shared secrets beneath the stars. Instead, he drove aimlessly through the town's outskirts, watching the landscape blur past him in shades of white and gray, searching for something he couldn't name. He wondered if there was a way to start over, to rebuild what had been broken. But the very thought filled him with a sense of exhaustion that made his hands tremble on the steering wheel. In the quiet of their home, where every creak of the floorboards seemed to amplify the tension between them, Luc and Camille continued their dance around the unspoken. The love they had once shared lingered like a ghost, haunting the spaces they moved through, reminding them of all they had lost. And though neither of them could bring themselves to say it, both knew that they had reached a crossroads, one that would either lead to a final, painful reckoning or to a slow, inevitable descent into something far colder than the winter that enveloped them. Chapter 10: Shadows of Despair. As spring began to tiptoe into the world, the icy grip of winter finally began to yield. The days lengthened, sunlight breaking through the clouds to cast a warm glow over the landscape. Snowdrifts melted into puddles that danced in the sunlight, and the trees, once bare and shivering, began to swell with tender green buds, heralding the promise of renewal. Yet within Luc and Camille's home, the season of change felt like a distant echo, an impossible dream that had long since faded away. Luc found himself waking to the sound of birds chirping outside their window, a melody that should have filled him with warmth but instead felt like a taunt, a reminder of the joy that had eluded him for so long. The mornings came and went, each one an exercise in pretending to engage with the world. He would shuffle through the motions of getting ready for work, the humdrum of routine providing a small comfort in the chaos of his feelings. He would glance at Camille, still wrapped in sleep, her hair a halo of disarray on the pillow, and for a fleeting moment, he would feel a flicker of something familiar, a longing for the love that had once been so vibrant. But as the day wore on, that flicker would dim, lost beneath the weight of their shared silence. The office became a refuge, a place where the demands of his job consumed his thoughts and energy, allowing him to momentarily forget the tensions at home. He immersed himself in deadlines and presentations, the sterile environment offering a sense of control that he desperately craved. Yet, even there, he could not escape the shadows that loomed over him, the persistent nagging that whispered of a life unfulfilled. Camille, too, sought refuge in the springtime light, but it felt as though she were standing on the brink of a precipice, looking down into the depths of her own despair. With each passing day, the tension in her chest tightened, a constant reminder of the unexpressed emotions she struggled to contain. The canvases she painted in her studio shifted with the season, transforming from dark and turbulent images to lighter, more ethereal landscapes. Yet even as her brush danced across the canvas, she felt a disconnection between the beauty she created and the turmoil that churned within her. The annual spring festival in their town loomed closer, a time of celebration and togetherness that once filled Luc and Camille with joy. They had spent many afternoons wandering the stalls, hand in hand, delighting in the vibrant displays of flowers and homemade crafts. Yet this year, the very thought of it filled Camille with dread. She could not bear the idea of attending, surrounded by families and couples reveling in the joy of the season, while her own heart felt heavy with longing and regret. Luc, sensing the distance growing between them, made an effort to rekindle some semblance of connection. He proposed they attend the festival together, hoping that the energy of the crowd might revive the sparks of their past. Camille agreed, her heart a jumble of emotions. She wanted to say yes, to be the wife Luc deserved, yet a part of her craved the solitude of her own company, the freedom to reflect without the pressure of their fractured relationship looming over her. But as she nodded in agreement, she felt the familiar pang of guilt, convinced that this was what she needed to do to ease the tension between them. On the day of the festival, Luc prepared with a sense of determination that he hadn't felt in a long time. He dressed with care, pulling on a crisp button-up shirt that made him feel a semblance of his old self. He moved about the house with purpose, determined to infuse some joy into their shared experience. Camille watched him from the kitchen, her heart heavy with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. She admired the effort he was making but felt an acute awareness of the fragile state of their relationship. As they drove to the festival, the sun filtered through the trees, casting playful shadows across the road. Luc attempted to engage Camille in light conversation, recounting funny anecdotes from work, but the silence hung heavily between them, punctuated only by the sound of the car engine and the rustling of the wind. Each word he spoke felt like an effort to bridge an insurmountable gap, but the weight of unspoken feelings lingered, pulling them apart even as they sat side by side. Upon arrival, the festival unfolded before them like a tapestry woven with vibrant colors and lively sounds. Children laughed and ran through the maze of booths, their joy palpable as they chased one another, faces painted with delight. Couples strolled hand in hand, sharing cotton candy and whispered secrets. The air was thick with the scent of blooming flowers and the sweet aroma of pastries, a reminder of the sweetness that had once flavored their love. Luc and Camille wandered through the festival, their movements synchronized yet somehow disconnected, as if they were two performers lost in a choreographed dance they could no longer follow. They passed by stalls filled with handcrafted trinkets and local art, Luc attempting to share his enthusiasm with Camille, pointing out unique pieces and making suggestions. But each suggestion fell flat, met with a half-hearted smile that barely touched her eyes. Camille found herself drawn to a stall adorned with painted pots overflowing with flowers, their vivid hues a stark contrast to the dull ache in her heart. She reached out to touch the petals, their softness stirring a sense of longing within her. As she stood there, surrounded by the beauty of spring, she felt a well of emotion rising within her, an overwhelming mix of happiness for the world around her and despair for her own life. She wanted to capture that fleeting feeling of joy, but it felt just out of reach, like a delicate butterfly that flitted away before she could grasp it. Luc watched Camille from a distance, feeling the tightness in his chest as he observed her lingering over the flowers. He wanted to reach out to her, to draw her back into their shared experience, but the fear of rejection held him back. He could sense that something was shifting within her, that beneath the surface of her calm exterior lay a tempest of emotions, and he felt helpless in the face of it. As the day wore on, they ventured through the festival grounds, but every moment felt marred by an invisible barrier. They participated in activities, watching a performance by local musicians, taking part in games, but the laughter of the crowd felt like a distant echo, a reminder of what they had lost. They were two souls adrift in a sea of celebration, yearning for the connection they had once shared but unable to bridge the growing divide. When dusk fell, casting a warm glow over the festival, Luc suggested they find a quiet spot to watch the fireworks display. Camille nodded, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions as they made their way to a small hill overlooking the festivities. As they settled onto the grass, she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the warmth of Luc's presence both comforting and suffocating. The first firework exploded in a brilliant display of colors, lighting up the night sky with its fleeting beauty. Luc watched Camille's face illuminated by the bursts of light, her eyes wide with wonder. For a moment, he felt a glimmer of hope, convinced that the magic of the evening might spark something within her, that it could somehow reignite the love they once shared. He reached out, brushing his fingers against hers, a small gesture laden with the weight of unspoken words. But as the fireworks continued to light up the sky, Camille felt a swell of sadness wash over her. The colors above were beautiful, but they felt like a stark reminder of the vibrancy that had faded from her life. Each explosion of light mirrored the turmoil within her, a flash of brilliance followed by a darkness that seemed to close in around her. The moment felt both breathtaking and hollow, and as she glanced sideways at Luc, she couldn't help but feel the gulf between them widening. As the last firework faded into the night, Camille's heart sank. She realized that despite their shared experiences, they had become strangers bound by a history they could no longer connect with. The realization hit her like a wave, and in that instant, she felt as if she were drowning in the silence that had grown between them. With the festival winding down, Luc stood to leave, his heart heavy with the weight of the day. They walked back to the car in silence, the cheerful chatter of festival-goers fading behind them, leaving only the sound of their footsteps on the pavement. Luc felt the familiar ache in his chest as he glanced at Camille, whose gaze was fixed ahead, her expression unreadable. He wanted to ask her how she felt, to delve into the depths of her heart, but fear gripped him. A fear of what he might uncover, a fear of losing her completely. As they drove home, the night enveloped them in a shroud of quiet despair. The streetlights cast flickering shadows inside the car, and the sound of the engine became a monotonous lullaby. Luc stole glances at Camille, who stared out the window, lost in thought, her expression distant and melancholic. The flicker of hope he had felt at the festival dimmed as they returned to the reality of their lives. Once home, Luc switched on the lights, illuminating the space that had grown so familiar yet felt so alien. Camille moved toward the studio, her sanctuary filled with half-finished canvases that told the stories of her inner turmoil. Luc hesitated, unsure whether to follow her or retreat to his own thoughts, feeling the weight of the day heavy on his shoulders. He chose to remain in the living room, where he sat on the couch, staring blankly at the wall. The shadows danced around him, and he felt a profound sense of loss wash over him. The memories of their shared laughter, their intimate moments, and the love that had once flourished between them felt like wisps of smoke, elusive and fleeting. In the studio, Camille stood before her latest painting, a vibrant swirl of colors that captured the beauty of spring yet felt deeply introspective. She picked up her brush and began to paint, pouring her emotions onto the canvas in a flurry of strokes. Each movement was a cathartic release, an attempt to find solace in the chaos that enveloped her heart. The colors blended and collided, reflecting her inner struggle, a battle between longing and despair, hope, and resignation. As the night wore on, Luc eventually made his way to the studio, drawn by the soft sounds of Camille at work. He stood at the threshold, watching her transform her emotions into something tangible, her brow furrowed in concentration, and he felt a flicker of admiration for her talent. Yet the distance between them felt insurmountable. He longed to reach out, to connect with her, but the silence wrapped around them like a heavy blanket, stifling any words he might have found. The air was thick with unexpressed feelings, and as Camille stepped back from her canvas, her gaze caught Luc's, and for a moment, time stood still. The room was awash with colors and shadows, a reflection of their shared journey. In that silence, both were acutely aware of the rift that had formed between them, and despite the flicker of hope that had ignited during the festival, the reality of their situation weighed heavily on their hearts. In the quiet aftermath of the day, they stood in the studio together, two souls entwined in a shared struggle, searching for a path back to each other amidst the chaos of their emotions. And though the road ahead seemed uncertain, the glimmer of hope remained, fragile yet resilient, like the first blooms of spring breaking through the frost. Chapter 11. Strained Devotion. The days melted into weeks, and the world around Luc and Camille continued to shift with the rhythm of the seasons. Spring blossomed into summer, painting the landscape in vibrant hues of green and gold. The days stretched long, filled with the promise of warmth and adventure. Yet within the walls of their home, a heavy stillness loomed, casting a shadow over their once vibrant relationship. Luc watched as the world outside their window transformed, the laughter of children playing in the sun echoing against the quiet confines of their living room. The warm breeze carried the sweet scent of blooming flowers, yet the fragrance only deepened the ache in his heart. Each day, he would sit in silence, pondering the love that felt like a fading photograph, edges frayed and colors washed out, a reminder of the beauty that had once filled their lives. Camille, too, felt the weight of the changing seasons pressing down on her. She sought solace in her studio, pouring her heart into her art, yet every brushstroke felt like a futile attempt to capture the fleeting essence of her happiness. As the sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating her canvases, she felt as though she were painting a dream, a vivid landscape that existed only in her imagination, a world where her love for Luc was unblemished by the scars of their past. But as the summer sun blazed overhead, it brought with it a sense of urgency that gnawed at Camille's heart. The vibrant festivals and gatherings in their town filled her with a bittersweet longing. Each celebration seemed to spotlight their isolation. It was as if the world had moved on while they remained trapped in a cycle of heartache, both longing for connection yet fearing the vulnerability that came with it. One afternoon, driven by a sudden impulse, Camille decided to visit the local park. The idea of stepping outside, of being enveloped in the warmth of the sun and the laughter of others, felt like a much-needed escape. She dressed simply, slipping into a sundress that twirled around her knees, hoping to recapture a sense of joy that had long been missing. As she walked through the familiar streets, the sounds of children playing and birds chirping filled the air, yet an invisible wall separated her from the joy around her. The park was alive with color and laughter, a tapestry of life unfolding before her. Families picnicked on the grass, couples strolled hand in hand, and the vibrant hues of flowers danced in the gentle breeze. Camille settled onto a bench beneath a blooming cherry tree, the soft petals cascading like confetti around her. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, to soak in the vibrant energy of life, and yet, the joy felt like a distant echo. As she sat there, lost in thought, Camille couldn't shake the feeling of being an observer in her own life. The warmth of the sun felt comforting, yet it also illuminated the chasm that had grown between her and Luc. She thought about their earlier years, the passion that had once ignited their love, and how it had slowly faded beneath the weight of reality. It was as if she were trapped in a broken mirror, reflecting pieces of their life together, yet unable to see the whole picture. Back at home, Luc occupied himself with chores around the house, a methodical distraction from the emptiness that had settled within him. He attempted to fill the silence with the hum of a vacuum cleaner, the rhythmic sound offering a false sense of control. But with each task, he could feel the hollowness of his actions. Cleaning and organizing felt futile when the real mess lay in their hearts, tangled and bruised. As evening approached, Luc glanced at the clock, realizing Camille had been gone for hours. A swell of worry rushed through him, an instinctual reaction born from the deep connection they still shared. He had noticed her retreat into herself more often, the way she seemed to slip further away with each passing day. Yet he struggled to understand how to bridge that gap, how to reach out and pull her back into the light. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across their home as Luc poured himself a glass of water and sat on the couch, his heart heavy with the weight of unspoken words. As he stared out the window, he couldn't help but wonder what Camille was thinking, what she was feeling as she wandered through the world without him. Meanwhile, as the sky shifted from blue to orange, Camille remained in the park, feeling a strange sense of liberation mixed with sorrow. She watched the world around her, absorbing the sights and sounds of life. But despite the beauty, a void lingered in her heart. She remembered the time they had spent here together, laughing and sharing dreams, and the nostalgia tugged at her soul, a bittersweet reminder of what they had lost. As twilight descended, Camille reluctantly made her way back home, the weight of the world resting on her shoulders. The sky darkened, stars flickering into existence like distant memories. The streetlights illuminated her path, yet they offered little comfort against the shadow of despair that followed her. When she arrived home, Luc was waiting, a flicker of hope lighting his eyes as he saw her. He wanted to reach out, to ask her about her day, to share the silence that hung between them. But as she stepped inside, the moment felt charged with unspoken feelings, the air thick with anticipation. Camille offered a weak smile, but Luc could see the shadows behind her eyes. She moved to the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water, the sound of the glass echoing in the silence. He watched her, longing to break the quiet but unsure of how to bridge the gap that had grown between them. As Camille leaned against the counter, she felt the weight of the day settle on her chest. The laughter and joy she had experienced in the park seemed to dissolve in the face of reality, leaving her feeling hollow and lost. She turned her gaze toward Luc, who stood just a few steps away, their eyes locking for a brief moment. In that instant, the unspoken words hung in the air, a fragile connection that flickered like a candle in the dark. Days turned into weeks, and the shadows in their relationship deepened. The warmth of summer faded into the coolness of autumn, and the air turned crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves. Luc and Camille found themselves ensnared in a routine that felt like a cycle of longing and despair. They moved through their days in silence, their hearts yearning for connection but trapped in a web of unspoken emotions. One evening, as the leaves turned golden and began to blanket the ground, Luc decided to venture into the heart of the town, a small festival celebrating the changing seasons. He hoped to share a moment with Camille, to breathe in the scent of cinnamon and warmth that filled the air. The lights twinkled overhead, illuminating the faces of couples and families, each one a reminder of what they had lost. But as Luc searched for Camille in the crowd, he felt the pang of isolation creeping in once again. He navigated the maze of stalls, each vibrant display a mockery of their fading love. Finally, he spotted her at a stall adorned with pumpkins, her fingers tracing the surface of the orange gourds. She looked beautiful in the soft glow of the lights, yet the distance between them felt insurmountable. He approached her, his heart racing with hope, but as he drew closer, he noticed the way she held herself, tense, guarded, as if the joy surrounding her had become a burden. The laughter of children echoed around them, but to Luc, it all felt muted, as if the world had blurred around the edges. As they stood together, Camille looked at the pumpkins, but the vibrant colors seemed to mock the grayness of their reality. She felt lost in the celebration, the joy of others only amplifying her own sorrow. Luc sensed the heaviness in her demeanor, but words escaped him. They lingered in the air, unspoken and unacknowledged, like a fog that refused to lift. That night, they returned home, the silence stretching between them like an unbridgeable chasm. Luc's heart ached with the weight of what he wanted to say, but he couldn't find the words. He wanted to reach out, to touch her hand and let her know that they could find their way back to each other, but the fear of rejection loomed large. As Camille settled into her studio, the cool air around her felt thick with unspoken tension. She picked up her brush and began to paint, the colors swirling together in a chaotic blend of emotion. Each stroke was a cathartic release, yet it did little to ease the turmoil that churned within her. She felt as though she were drowning in her own despair, surrounded by beauty but unable to grasp it. The weeks wore on, and as autumn deepened, the world outside transformed into a canvas of reds, oranges, and yellows. Yet within their home, the atmosphere felt stagnant, their love trapped in a cycle of unfulfilled desires. Camille often found herself painting landscapes that mirrored her feelings, vibrant on the surface, but with an undercurrent of darkness that echoed the tumult in her heart. As the days turned into nights, Luc threw himself into work, seeking solace in his responsibilities. But the loneliness followed him like a shadow, reminding him of the love that had once been so vibrant. Each passing day felt like a reminder of what they had lost, a heart-wrenching acknowledgement that the connection they once shared had become a distant memory. One evening, Camille stood before her easel, staring at a canvas that remained blank, a testament to her struggles. She felt paralyzed by the weight of her emotions, the colors swirling in her mind, yet unable to translate them onto the canvas. The silence of the house felt deafening, amplifying the ache in her chest. As she fought against her despair, Camille glanced out of the window. The stars glittered against the deep blue sky, each one a reminder of the hope that still flickered within her. She thought of Luc, of the love they had once shared, and the memories that felt like ghosts haunting their every moment. Determined to break the cycle of silence, Camille made her way to the living room. As she stepped inside, she found Luc sitting on the couch, a book resting unopened on his lap. Their eyes met, and in that brief moment, the air crackled with the weight of their shared sorrow. Camille felt a surge of courage, the desire to reach out and mend the fractures that had formed between them. Yet, as she opened her mouth to speak, the fear of vulnerability gripped her heart, and the words faltered. Instead, she took a deep breath, stepping closer, her heart pounding as she searched Luc's gaze for a flicker of understanding. The room was heavy with unexpressed feelings, each of them longing to bridge the distance that had grown between them. In that moment, both Luc and Camille knew they stood on the precipice of a decision, a choice to either confront the shadows of their past or allow the weight of their unspoken emotions to suffocate their love further. And as the night deepened around them, the uncertainty lingered in the air like the scent of autumn leaves, crisp and bittersweet, echoing the fragility of their connection. Chapter 12. A Forbidden Escape. As autumn's chill settled over the landscape, the days grew shorter, and the nights seemed to stretch endlessly. Luc and Camille moved through their lives like ghosts in a familiar house, haunted by the echoes of their laughter that once filled the air. The world outside transformed into a patchwork of browns and golds, leaves swirling down from the trees like whispers of a love long gone. Within the confines of their home, the atmosphere felt heavy, filled with an unshakable tension. Each corner of the house was laden with memories that taunted them, reminders of a time when joy flowed freely between them. Yet, now, the silence weighed on them like an anchor, pulling them deeper into despair. Luc spent his days buried in work, using the rhythm of deadlines and meetings to distract himself from the gnawing emptiness. Yet, each moment of success felt hollow, as though he were merely going through the motions of a life that no longer held meaning. He had become a master of avoidance, skillfully deflecting questions about his well-being from friends and colleagues, all while the truth simmered just beneath the surface. His heart ached for Camille. Camille, on the other hand, immersed herself in her art, trying to channel her emotions onto the canvas. The paintbrush became an extension of her feelings, allowing her to express the chaos within. Yet, no matter how vibrant the colors, each piece felt incomplete, a reflection of her struggle to grasp the complexities of her heart. She found herself painting scenes of love and warmth, yet the images were tainted by a sense of longing and loss, the joy of creation overshadowed by the sorrow that loomed over her. As days melted into weeks, the impending holiday season approached, bringing with it the promise of family gatherings and joyful celebrations. Yet, in their home, the spirit of the season felt like a ghostly apparition, flickering in and out of focus. They watched the world prepare for festivities, families laughing and sharing moments of joy, while they remained trapped in their silent struggle. One evening, as the first snowflakes began to fall, Camille found herself standing in front of the window, her breath fogging the glass. The world outside transformed into a winter wonderland, each flake a delicate reminder of beauty amidst the cold. She pressed her palms against the glass, as if trying to connect with the life beyond her reach. The snow painted a fresh canvas over the familiar landscape, yet within her heart, the colors felt muted, clouded by the weight of their unspoken grievances. Luc entered the room, his footsteps soft against the wooden floor, but Camille did not turn to face him. Instead, she continued to gaze outside, watching as the snow danced through the air, swirling in the gentle breeze. In that moment, she felt the ache of longing for the connection they once shared, the easy laughter and unguarded moments that had defined their love. As the snow piled up outside, Camille remembered the winters they had spent together, building snowmen and having snowball fights, the world alive with laughter and warmth. She thought of the cozy evenings spent curled up on the couch, sharing stories by the fire, each moment a thread woven into the fabric of their love. Now, those memories felt like distant stars, shining brightly yet painfully out of reach. Sensing Camille's introspection, Luc stepped closer, a quiet urge to bridge the chasm that had formed between them. He could see her shoulders tense, the way her brow furrowed in concentration. The silence wrapped around them like a thick blanket, heavy with unspoken words. Luc wished he could read her thoughts, to understand the turmoil swirling within her, to know how to break through the wall that had built between them. In an effort to fill the silence, he moved to the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner. The rhythmic chopping of vegetables and the simmering of sauces provided a familiar backdrop to the quiet, but even in this mundane task, he felt the weight of their distance. Each sound echoed in the empty space around him, amplifying the void that lay between their hearts. As Luc set the table, the clinking of dishes felt foreign, a sound that should signify warmth but instead only deepened the chill in the air. He placed 2 plates across from each other, their arrangement a poignant reminder of the conversations that had once flowed freely between them, the laughter that had danced in the air, now replaced by an unsettling quiet. When dinner was ready, Luc called Camille, and she entered the dining room, her expression still distant. They sat across from each other, the table acting as a barrier, a stark reminder of the emotional distance that now separated them. The food, carefully prepared, went untouched for moments that felt like an eternity, each bite weighed down by unspoken feelings. As the evening wore on, Camille began to eat, the silence stretching on, heavy and thick. Luc could see the shadows under her eyes, the way she seemed to stare at her plate as if it held the answers to the questions that loomed large in both their hearts. He wanted to reach across the table, to hold her hand and reassure her that they could still find their way back to each other. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in white, a stark contrast to the emotions swirling within their home. With each flake that settled softly on the ground, Luc felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could reclaim the warmth they had lost. After dinner, Camille retreated to her studio, the desire to create consuming her. She poured herself into her work, hoping to lose herself in the colors and textures that filled her canvases. But the moment she began to paint, the brush felt heavy in her hand, as if burdened by the weight of her heartache. She longed for inspiration, for the spark that had once ignited her passion, but all she could find was a lingering emptiness. Luc, meanwhile, settled onto the couch, the flickering light of the fireplace casting shadows across the room. He watched as the flames danced, their warmth providing a temporary comfort against the chill that seemed to seep into every corner of the house. The fire crackled, a reminder of the life that still pulsed within their home. Yet it also served as a reminder of the distance that had grown between them. As the hours passed, the snow continued to fall, each flake a soft whisper of what could have been. Luc and Camille remained ensconced in their separate worlds, the silence growing thicker around them. The weight of their unspoken words hung heavily in the air, a palpable tension that suffocated any sense of warmth. That night, Camille lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, the darkness around her amplifying her feelings of isolation. She thought of Luc, of the love that had once felt like a fire, warm and consuming. Now, it felt like embers, fading and cold. She wanted to reach out to him, to bridge the chasm between them, but the fear of vulnerability held her back. In the stillness of the night, Camille closed her eyes and memories flooded her mind, each one a bittersweet reminder of the love they had shared. She remembered the first time they met, the spark that had ignited between them, and how they had laughed until their sides ached. She thought of their wedding day, the promises they had made, and the dreams they had built together. But those dreams felt like distant echoes now, drowned out by the weight of their struggles. As she lay there, Camille felt a deep yearning for the connection they had lost, a longing for home. A home built not of walls and roof but of love, trust, and understanding. The realization washed over her like a wave. The truth that they could still find their way back to each other if only they were willing to face the storms that lay ahead. In the other room, Luc too wrestled with his thoughts, the quiet of the house amplifying the confusion in his heart. He thought of Camille, of the way she had once illuminated his life, and how the laughter they had shared felt like a distant memory. He longed to break through the walls that had grown between them, to remind her of the love that still flickered, albeit dimly, within their hearts. As the night deepened and the snow continued to fall, both Luc and Camille felt the weight of their unspoken feelings press heavily against their chests. They yearned for connection, for understanding, yet the fear of vulnerability held them captive. The chill in the air seeped into their hearts, but the embers of hope still flickered, promising that amidst the darkness, a path toward healing awaited them. If only they could find the courage to take that first step. Chapter 13. A Glimmer of Hope. As winter tightened its grip on the world outside, the house became a cocoon, sheltering Luc and Camille from the biting cold. The snow continued to accumulate, blanketing the streets and trees in a soft, white embrace. Inside, The air was thick with unspoken words, heavy with the longing for connection. In the mornings, Luc would rise early, slipping quietly out of bed while Camille remained cocooned in the warmth of the blankets. The routine was familiar, almost comforting in its predictability, but each day felt like a missed opportunity to reach across the divide that separated them. He would brew coffee, the rich aroma filling the kitchen, but the stillness that enveloped their home often felt suffocating. Luc found solace in the rituals of life, in the mundane tasks that filled his days. The world outside was picturesque, transformed into a winter wonderland, yet he felt as if he were living in a different realm, one where the beauty of life had become overshadowed by the shadows of their past. He worked diligently, but the achievements he once celebrated felt hollow, devoid of the shared joy they once brought. As the days passed, Camille spent more time in her studio, her creative sanctuary becoming both an escape and a prison. She poured her emotions onto the canvas, swirling colors and shapes that reflected the turmoil within her. Yet, no matter how passionately she painted, the essence of her heart felt trapped, locked away behind walls she could not seem to breach. One evening, as the sky deepened to a velvet black, Camille took a break from her art. The silence in the house was almost palpable, wrapping around her like a heavy blanket. She looked out of the window, watching as the snow continued to fall, each flake a tiny miracle landing softly on the ground. The world outside sparkled with a beauty that seemed so far removed from the darkness she felt within. Determined to break the cycle of solitude that had engulfed them, Camille made a choice. She turned away from the window and walked down the hallway toward Luc's study. She hesitated for a moment, her heart racing at the thought of confronting the silence that had become their companion. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door, stepping into the room. Luc sat at his desk, papers scattered around him, a laptop glowing softly in the dim light. The room was filled with the soft hum of machinery, yet it felt like a tomb, life trapped beneath layers of neglect. When he glanced up at Camille, a flicker of surprise crossed his face, quickly replaced by a familiar mask of guardedness. Camille took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt as though she were walking a tightrope, each movement laden with the weight of uncertainty. The air between them felt charged, as if the walls were holding their breath in anticipation. Luc's eyes held a mixture of curiosity and caution, reflecting the internal battle they both faced. Camille felt the longing to reach out, to bridge the distance that had become so palpable, yet the fear of vulnerability tightened around her throat. Instead of speaking, she walked closer to the desk, her gaze drawn to the scattered papers. Among them, she noticed a photograph, their photograph, taken on a sunlit day long ago, captured in a moment of unfiltered joy. In the picture, they were beaming at each other, the world around them forgotten. It was a stark contrast to the shadows that now surrounded them. Feeling a surge of emotion, Camille reached out, her fingers grazing the edge of the photograph. It felt like a lifeline, a reminder of what they once shared. Luc's eyes followed her movement, a flicker of recognition crossing his face as he absorbed the moment. The photograph, once a symbol of their love, now served as a mirror reflecting the distance that had grown between them. Camille looked up at Luc, and in that instant, a wave of vulnerability washed over her. She saw in his eyes a yearning for connection, a desire to reclaim what had been lost. Time seemed to stretch as they stood in silence, the tension between them shifting ever so slightly. It was as if the universe held its breath, waiting for them to take the leap into the unknown. Camille felt a rush of warmth, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. As she searched his gaze, she noticed the weariness etched on Luc's face, the way his shoulders slumped under the weight of unspoken grief. It struck her then that they were both carrying their burdens alone, each of them too afraid to share their pain. The realization made her heart ache, for it was clear that beneath the facade of their struggles lay a shared love that still flickered, however dimly. Summoning her courage, Camille took a deep breath and moved closer, placing the photograph back down on the desk. She reached out and brushed her fingers against Luc's hand, a simple gesture that felt like an electric current sparking between them. The moment felt monumental, a connection forged in vulnerability. Luc's gaze softened, and he looked at their intertwined fingers as if they were a lifeline. He felt the warmth of her touch seep into him, melting away some of the ice that had encased his heart. In that brief moment, they were no longer two distant souls drifting apart. They were two hearts yearning for the warmth of love that had once enveloped them. As they stood together in the stillness of the room, the air grew lighter, the weight of their unspoken feelings lifting ever so slightly. Camille felt a surge of hope swell within her, a belief that perhaps they could navigate the turbulent waters together. And then, as if the universe was answering their silent plea, a gentle knock echoed through the house, breaking the fragile spell. Luc and Camille turned their heads toward the sound, their moment interrupted. The knock came again, more insistent this time, a reminder of the world outside their cocoon. Camille's heart sank slightly, but she knew that this was not an ending. It was merely a pause. The door opened, and a gust of cold air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of fresh snow and a promise of change. They both turned their attention to the door, and Camille felt Luc's hand linger next to hers, their fingers almost brushing together. The sound of laughter rang out, cheerful and bright, as a group of neighbors entered, bundled up in colorful winter coats. They came bearing gifts of food and holiday cheer, their energy a stark contrast to the stillness that had engulfed Luc and Camille. The sight of their friends, full of life and joy, stirred something deep within Camille, a reminder that love existed beyond the confines of their home, that warmth could still be found in shared moments and laughter. Luc released a breath he didn't know he was holding, a flicker of relief washing over him. He glanced at Camille, and in that moment, they exchanged a look that held 1,000 unspoken words, a silent agreement that their journey was far from over. As their friends filled the room, bringing with them laughter and light, Luc and Camille joined the gathering, their hearts still entwined in a fragile hope. Though the shadows of their past loomed large, they both felt the stirrings of a new beginning, a chance to rediscover the love that had been buried beneath the weight of their struggles. In the heart of winter, amidst the falling snow and laughter, they stood side by side, ready to take the next step together, one that might lead them back to the warmth of home, where love awaited them, no matter how long the road ahead might be. Chapter 14. The Heartbreak of Separation. The new year arrived like a whispered promise, its arrival marked by the soft glow of twinkling lights that adorned the streets. Snowflakes danced in the chilly air, and the world outside was transformed into a glistening landscape, each flake catching the light like tiny diamonds. The laughter and cheer of the recent holiday celebration still echoed in the corners of Luc and Camille's home, a lingering reminder of the warmth that had briefly enveloped them. Yet as the days turned into weeks, the glow began to fade, and the shadows of their past crept back into their lives. Despite the camaraderie they shared with friends, the underlying tension between Luc and Camille remained. They moved through their days like actors in a play, performing for an audience that believed they were still the couple lost in love. But inside, each was grappling with the weight of unspoken fears and unresolved emotions. Luc returned to work, immersing himself in projects that required his full attention. He found solace in the rhythm of deadlines and meetings, the fast-paced environment a welcome distraction from the emotional turmoil that lingered at home. But the hours he spent in the office served only to deepen the chasm between him and Camille. The more he buried himself in work, the more she felt the ache of loneliness. Camille, on the other hand, attempted to channel her emotions into her art. Her studio became a refuge, a space where she could pour her feelings onto canvas without fear of judgment. Yet, even in her creative pursuits, a lingering emptiness persisted. Each brushstroke felt both cathartic and suffocating, a reminder of the distance she and Luc were still trying to bridge. One gray afternoon, with the sky heavy with clouds, Camille stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The cold air stung her cheeks, invigorating her spirit as she wandered through the neighborhood, now draped in winter's quiet stillness. She found herself drawn to the small park where they had once spent countless afternoons, laughing and dreaming under the warm sun. The park was empty, save for a few trees burdened by the weight of snow. Camille walked along the path, the crunch of snow beneath her boots breaking the serene silence. She paused at a bench, its surface covered in a thick layer of white, and sat down, letting the cold seep through her clothing. As she gazed into the distance, memories flooded her mind, days filled with joy and laughter, moments when Luc's smile had brightened her world. She could still feel the warmth of his embrace, the tenderness of their shared dreams. But those memories were now tinged with sorrow, overshadowed by the reality they faced. The longer she sat there, the more she felt the weight of indecision pressing down on her. She knew that something had to change, yet the thought of taking a definitive step felt daunting. Luc had been so distant lately, lost in his own world of work and responsibilities. Each attempt she made to connect with him felt like pushing against a brick wall, leaving her with the unsettling feeling of being trapped in a cycle of unfulfilled longing. Just then, a figure approached, a child bundled up in bright winter gear, their laughter breaking through the silence. The child was accompanied by a golden retriever, bounding joyfully through the snow. The innocence of their play struck a chord within Camille, a bittersweet reminder of the life she had once envisioned with Luc, a life filled with laughter, family, and the simple joys of togetherness. As the child tossed snowballs for the dog to chase, Camille's heart ached with longing. She had always dreamed of having a family, of sharing the joys and challenges of parenthood with Luc. But now, that dream felt like a distant star, twinkling just out of reach. The playful scene in front of her sparked a glimmer of hope and resolve. Camille realized that perhaps it was time to confront the chasm that had grown between them. She could no longer be a passive participant in her life. She needed to take action, to open the lines of communication, no matter how difficult it might be. Determined, she rose from the bench and made her way back home, each step feeling lighter than the last. The winter landscape, though cold and stark, began to reflect the inner warmth she was reclaiming. When she arrived, she found Luc in his study, his brow furrowed in concentration as he pored over papers. She watched him for a moment, a mix of love and sorrow flooding her heart. Luc was still the man she adored, but the barriers between them had become walls of stone. She knew she couldn't allow the distance to consume them any longer. That evening, as they settled into their usual routine, Camille felt the weight of her resolve pressing upon her. Dinner was quiet, the clinking of cutlery punctuating the silence. She observed Luc as he methodically chewed, his eyes focused elsewhere, perhaps lost in thoughts that had nothing to do with her. When the meal concluded, Camille took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she needed to say. They both needed to address the unspoken truths that lingered between them, and she knew that it was now or never. With determination, she placed her hands on the table, leaning slightly forward, her heart racing with both fear and hope. She saw Luc glance up, and for a brief moment, their eyes met, igniting a spark of recognition in the air. But before she could gather her thoughts and express her feelings, the sound of a ringing phone shattered the fragile moment. Luc's phone vibrated on the table, a stark reminder of the world outside their home. He reached for it, and in that instant, Camille felt her resolve waver, the moment slipping through her fingers like sand. The conversation that ensued was short and businesslike, Luc's focus returning to the call as Camille sat back, disappointment washing over her. As he spoke, she watched him intently, the way his shoulders tightened, how he gestured slightly with his hands, caught up in whatever urgency awaited him. The reality of their situation sank in. No matter how much she longed for connection, the demands of life often intervened, creating barriers that were hard to overcome. When the call ended, Luc returned to his papers, and the moment they had shared vanished, leaving Camille feeling adrift once more. Days turned into weeks, and the conversation that Camille had hoped for never took place. The mundane routine of their lives continued, a cycle of work and quiet dinners, laughter and joy replaced by a lingering sense of unfulfilled desires. One evening, Camille found herself staring out the window, watching as the snow melted away, revealing patches of grass beneath. The promise of spring loomed on the horizon, yet her heart felt heavy with uncertainty. She realized she couldn't continue waiting for Luc to initiate the conversation. It was time for her to take control of her own happiness. As she reflected on their relationship, Camille recognized that the road ahead would not be easy. Change would demand courage and vulnerability from both of them, but she believed that love was worth fighting for. The desire for a family still pulsed within her, as did the love she felt for Luc. She vowed to approach him again, to express the longing that had been buried beneath layers of fear and misunderstanding. If they were ever to find their way back to each other, they would need to confront the shadows of their past and embrace the uncertainty of the future together. That night, as she lay in bed next to Luc, she felt the warmth of his body next to hers, the gentle rise and fall of his breath. It was a small comfort amidst the turmoil that churned within her. She closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer for clarity and courage, hoping that the dawn of a new day would bring with it the strength they both needed to navigate the crossroads of their lives. In the quiet darkness, she made a promise to herself. She would not allow fear to dictate their fate any longer. Camille would fight for their love, and no matter the outcome, she was ready to face the truth, to lay bare her heart and open the door to a new beginning. Chapter 15. Eerie Building Separate Paths. The air was filled with the fragrance of spring as Camille stepped outside, the world around her alive with the vibrant hues of blooming flowers and the gentle hum of nature awakening from its winter slumber. The sunlight poured down like golden honey, bathing everything in a warm glow that seemed to whisper promises of renewal and hope. It was a stark contrast to the heaviness that had hung over her heart for so long. Camille stood on the porch of her home, her gaze drifting across the landscape, the familiar sights infused with a sense of possibility. The birds chirped cheerfully, flitting about with the carefree exuberance of the season, and she closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to absorb the symphony of life around her. But within that beauty lay a sense of urgency, a need to confront the realities that had become impossible to ignore. Determined to break the cycle of silence, she took a deep breath and entered the house, where Luc was still asleep. The soft light of morning illuminated the room, casting gentle shadows against the walls. She watched him for a moment, the peaceful lines of his face a reminder of the man she had fallen in love with so many years ago. Yet, even in his stillness, she could sense the unspoken tension that lingered between them, an invisible barrier that had grown thicker with time. Camille felt a swell of resolve as she moved about the house, preparing breakfast with a newfound purpose. The clatter of pots and pans echoed softly in the kitchen, a familiar rhythm that had once brought them together. As she cooked, memories flooded her mind. Sizzling bacon, pancakes piled high, and Luc's laughter ringing out as they shared their mornings. Those moments had been filled with warmth, but now they felt like fragments of a distant past, buried beneath layers of heartache and unmet expectations. When breakfast was ready, Camille set the table with care, arranging the plates and silverware with a meticulousness that belied the turmoil within her. She wanted this moment to be special, to rekindle the connection that had slowly unraveled. She could almost feel the weight of their shared dreams lingering in the air, waiting for the opportunity to rise again. After a while, Luc emerged from the bedroom, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. The warmth of the sunlight streaming in through the window painted him in soft hues, and for a fleeting moment, Camille felt the flicker of hope ignite within her. They exchanged glances, and in that shared silence, she sensed a yearning in Luc's gaze that mirrored her own. As they settled down for breakfast, the atmosphere crackled with unspoken words. Camille focused on the meal, serving Luc with care, but the weight of their past loomed large between them. Each bite was accompanied by the tension of unaddressed feelings, and Camille knew that she had to take the leap. After they finished eating, Camille cleared the table, her heart racing as she prepared to broach the subject that had occupied her thoughts for so long. She gathered the dishes, her movements deliberate as she created a sense of normalcy. Yet, inside, she felt the walls closing in, and the butterflies in her stomach intensified with each passing moment. Once the kitchen was tidy, Camille turned to Luc, her heart pounding as she searched for the right words. But before she could articulate her feelings, Luc stood up and excused himself, retreating to his study. The moment slipped away like grains of sand, and a wave of disappointment washed over her. The afternoon wore on, and Camille felt the ache of missed opportunities settle heavily in her chest. She found herself wandering through the house, the familiar spaces feeling like a labyrinth of memories, each room filled with echoes of laughter, shared dreams, and the silent ghosts of what had been. The photographs lining the walls told the story of their love, a chronicle of moments that now felt like distant relics of a happier time. With each step, the weight of their unsaid words grew heavier. She knew she had to find a way to bridge the distance between them, to reach into the depths of their hearts and bring forth the love that had once thrived in the open air of their shared lives. Later that evening, as twilight cast its soft glow over the world, Camille found herself sitting on the porch, the cool breeze brushing against her skin. The golden light of the setting sun bathed everything in warmth, but the chill of uncertainty wrapped around her heart like a shroud. She felt a deep longing for connection, the desire to hold Luc close and share the fears that had taken root in her heart. Just then, Luc joined her on the porch, taking a seat beside her. The silence enveloped them, but this time, it felt different. The air was charged with unspoken emotions, and Camille sensed that they were both standing on the precipice of something monumental. As they sat side by side, the stars began to twinkle overhead, illuminating the night sky in a dance of light. Camille turned to Luc, her heart racing as she took a leap of faith. She reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his, a simple gesture, but one filled with meaning. Luc looked down at their hands, the contact igniting a spark between them. In that moment, Camille felt the warmth of his presence seep into her, melting away the barriers that had kept them apart. With her heart pounding, she took a deep breath and turned to face him fully. She could see the concern etched on his face, the vulnerability in his eyes mirroring her own. In that silence, Camille felt the weight of their shared history pressing down on them, urging her to speak the truths that had long remained unvoiced. But as she opened her mouth to express the longing that had consumed her, a profound sadness washed over her. Camille knew that no matter what words fell from her lips, the pain of the past could not simply be erased. The journey they had taken was fraught with trials, and the scars ran deep. And yet, amidst that sadness, she felt an undeniable flicker of hope. The love they had shared had weathered storms, and while it had been bruised, it had not been extinguished. It flickered in the depths of their hearts, waiting for the right moment to reignite. The stars twinkled above them, a reminder of the beauty that could emerge from darkness. In that moment, Camille realized that they were at a crossroads, a pivotal moment that could shape their future. It was an opportunity to confront their pain, to confront each other, and to lay bare their souls. As the night deepened, Camille took a leap of faith once more. She spoke, her voice steady and filled with conviction, her heart laid bare before him. She spoke of the love that had sustained them, of the dreams they had forged together, and of the longing she felt for a future where they could reclaim what had been lost. Luc listened intently, his gaze fixed on her, and in that moment, Camille felt the walls between them begin to crumble. As she shared her heart, she could see the understanding dawning in his eyes. The distance that had seemed insurmountable began to shrink, and the air felt charged with possibility. They spoke of their fears, their dreams, and the ways they had each grown apart. Camille shared her guilt, the weight of her choices, and the realization that they had both been trapped in their own cycles of pain. Luc, too, revealed his struggles, the feelings of inadequacy that had haunted him since his accident. Together, they confronted the shadows of their past, acknowledging the mistakes that had led them to this point. Each revelation felt like a catharsis, washing away the years of resentment and misunderstanding that had clouded their relationship. With every word exchanged, they peeled back the layers of hurt, revealing the raw vulnerability that lay beneath. As they continued to talk under the starry sky, Camille felt a sense of liberation wash over her. It was as if they were shedding the weight of the past, embracing the possibility of a future untainted by regret. They spoke of the love that had once flourished, of the dreams they had held dear, and the yearning for connection that still lingered between them. With each word, they built a bridge of understanding, forgiveness, and hope. And as they shared their stories, the distance between them shrank, replaced by a deepened connection that was forged in vulnerability and honesty. When the night came to a close, they sat in comfortable silence, hand in hand, their hearts intertwined in a way they had thought lost forever. They had faced their past and emerged on the other side, renewed and revitalized. The darkness had not defeated them. Instead, it had illuminated the path forward. As dawn broke, casting a soft light over the world, Camille knew that their journey was far from over. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. Together, they would navigate the complexities of their relationship, embracing the uncertainties with open hearts. The echoes of their love reverberated in the air, and as they shared that first light of day, Camille felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey they had undertaken. They had weathered the storm, and in doing so, had rediscovered the love that had once ignited their souls. In that moment, Camille understood that love was not just about the good times. It was about resilience, forgiveness, and the courage to face the darkness together. And as they moved forward into the dawn of a new day, she knew that their hearts would forever carry the echoes of tomorrow, whispers of hope, love, and the promise of a brighter future.